Hi, and welcome to the NewsGuard Academy. In today's video, we're going to go over how to determine the political leaning of a news website, if there is one, and what NewsGuard considers to be an adequate disclosure of political perspective based on one of NewsGuard's 9 criteria that assess the credibility and transparency of news websites. Some news sites publish straight news, and others approach their news with a particular perspective. At NewsGuard, we don't believe that one approach is inherently better than the other. Instead, we look for news sites that do have a particular perspective to disclose that to readers in a prominent location. This is based on the criterion, handles the difference between news and opinion responsibly. The explanation for this criterion states, content providers who convey the impression that they report news or a mix of news and opinion distinguish opinion from news reporting, and when reporting news, do not egregiously cherry-pick facts or stories to advance opinions. Content providers who advance a particular point of view disclose that point of view. Today, we will be focused on the second half of that criterion, that content providers who advance a particular point of view disclose that point of view. But even when a perspective is clearly disclosed, news publishers should not publish opinionated language under the heading News under NewsGuard standards. This is because a typical reader would expect to run into straightforward news when reading an article labeled as news. Today, we'll look at a few examples of sites that disclose their perspective well, and some that don't. We'll also discuss giveaways of a site's political perspective that you can look out for to be a smart news consumer. When you come across a news website that you're not familiar with, the best place to start is the About page. Let's look at the About page for nationalreview.com. We click on the sidebar, go to More, and then About, we can see that it clearly states that the National Review is a magazine of conservative opinion. This is a clear, adequate disclosure in NewsGuard's view. If we go back to the homepage and look at some of the headlines, now is the moment to deregulate Obamacare. We sued an Ohio school district over preferred pronouns and won. We can see that these headlines do reflect that conservative perspective. As such, National Review passes the criterion for handles the difference between news and opinion responsibly. Similarly, let's look at the news website for The Nation. If we go to the sidebar and click on About, we can see that it clearly states that this is a progressive website. Going back to the homepage, we can see that the headlines, Trump promised to bring back coal, this town listened. Zoran Mondami is following a trail that Jesse Jackson blazed. How the UK media became complicit in Gaza genocide. These headlines clearly reflect that progressive perspective. Now let's examine some sites that do not meet NewsGuard's standard for handling the difference between news and opinion responsibly. Let's start with thefederalist.com. The Federalist does not have an About page. At the top of their homepage, it says, "Be lovers of freedom and anxious of the fray." NewsGuard does not consider this to be a disclosure of a political perspective. However, if we look at some of the headlines on the homepage, we need to deport 1 million illegal immigrants a month. Someone needs to explain how an illegal alien wanted for terrorism got a CDL license. Democrats will rig the midterms if red states let them after Texas ruling. None of these articles are labeled as opinion. However, they're clearly advancing a conservative perspective. Another site that NewsGuard has found to not properly disclose its political perspective is Made Us Touch News. If we go to their About Us page, we can see that they describe themselves as a pro-democracy news network. It's important to note that a lot of liberal sites will use this language of pro-democracy. However, at NewsGuard, we do not consider this to be a clear disclosure of a liberal perspective. If we go to the homepage, we can see that these headlines, Minnesota GOP representative takes credit for air traffic fund he voted against. Convicted church bomb plotter donated to J.D. Vance. Pro-Trump host calls out Trump's Epstein file delay. These headlines clearly reflect a liberal perspective. It's unclear, however, that pro-democracy indicates this liberal perspective, so that is why Midas Touch News does not pass that criterion. Let's examine one more site, slaynews.com. If we go to their About page, it states that Slay News is unapologetically pro-America and pro-free speech. Just like how pro-democracy is common language among liberal sites, pro-America and pro-free speech are terms we typically see on conservative-leaning websites. However, at NewsGuard, we do not consider this to be an adequate disclosure of a conservative perspective. However, if we go to the homepage for Slay News, we can see that the headlines, New Jersey Democrat arrested for raping a child, George Soros bankrolled effort to kill Musk's Twitter and silence conservative media. These headlines clearly reflect a conservative perspective that is not disclosed by saying pro-America and pro-free speech. While the terms pro-democracy and pro-America can signal the political leaning of a website because these terms have been somewhat hijacked by the left and the right, it's true that most Americans would consider themselves to be pro-democracy, pro-America, and pro-free speech. As such, at NewsGuard, we look for more clear disclosures, such as liberal, conservative, left-leaning, right-leaning, progressive, etc. To summarize, many news sites approach their news from a particular political perspective. At NewsGuard, we believe that as long as that perspective is disclosed, a news site is behaving responsibly. However, many sites do not disclose their perspective at all, or use vague terms such as pro-democracy or pro-America, which we do not consider to be an adequate disclosure. It's important to be mindful that some news sites do approach their news from a particular lens. Look at the About page for a disclosure, and look quickly at the site's overall coverage on its homepage. If the content seems to all be leaning one way, take note of that. It's likely you're not encountering straight news. And one final note. Even if a site discloses their perspective, a site can still fail NewsGuard's criteria for handling the difference between news and opinion responsibly if they label opinionated content as news. While the disclosure allows the site to have a particular slant, such as a conservative site that focuses on illegal immigration or a liberal site that focuses on abortion access, it does not permit a site to publish opinionated content under the label of news. But that being said, being forthright about a site's philosophy is extremely important, especially for readers new to the site. Thanks for watching the NewsGuard Academy, a video series about practical tips to spot falsehoods and verify information on your social media and news feeds. I'm Sophia Rubinson, an editor of NewsGuard's Reality Check newsletter. To learn more about NewsGuard's standards of reliability, be sure to subscribe to NewsGuard's Reality Check newsletter at newsguardrealitycheck.com. See you in the next video.